Hello YouTube, welcome back to the Variety Channel. Uh, this is an illustration that I've made to show what happens when your tire pressure is set too high, say on your bicycle, but this information can actually also apply to your vehicle. So what I'm showing here is when I was a kid, I started out riding on BMX bicycles, and I still ride bikes, but generally now I ride mountain bikes for the most part. And the bicycle that I'm currently riding is a mountain bike that has no suspension, so it's a hardtail and it has a fixed front fork. Um, Now, when I was a kid and I used to set the tire pressures on my BMX bike, I went by the manufacturer's recommendations for the tire, and that was generally around 35 psi. But back then, I can't really tell you how much I weighed, but much less than now. Um, and I'm also showing a little bit about a contact patch down there. So what I'm illustrating is you can see with a tire pressure of 32 or 35 psi that on the front I'm showing that the contact patch is much smaller than the rear. Um, and that's because when you're riding your bicycle, generally your weight is focused more over the back tire. So that's why the contact patch is a little bit larger on the rear of the bicycle. There you can see those little ovals. Uh, and so I would have had more traction on the back because of my weight. And you can see that the contact patch is very small there on the front. Uh, and what that did is it gave me low traction on the front, and most of my traction came out of the rear of the bicycle. Um, and I'm also showing the front tire is actually bouncing over a rock or an obstacle. So what I'm showing there is the front tire has actually hit the obstacle and bounced up. And that happens when your tire pressure is just too high for the terrain that you're riding on. So you end up getting a rough ride. So what you should do, and I'm not saying that a tire pressure of 32 or 35 psi is wrong. Generally, what they're trying to do is give you a maximum rolling efficiency. Uh, but the recommendation doesn't really take into account the terrain you're riding on. Um, it kind of does and kind of doesn't, but what's more important is it doesn't really take into account the rider's weight. So what's preferable to do is to actually lower your tire pressure low enough to where it's still going to support your weight, but the tire pressure will be low enough to where the tires will actually conform to the terrain. So you can see there is the tire is actually conforming to that stick and the rock that I'm showing. That's a stick and a rock. And so I have another illustration here showing what happens to the contact patches when you adjust the tire pressure to accommodate your weight and where it's focused. So I've actually set the front tire pressure down to 22 and the rear I've taken it down to 28. Now you can adjust your tire pressures up and down depending on your weight or how efficient you want your bicycle to be, or basically how comfortable you want it to be. So those are all things to take in mind whenever you're trying to find the right weight. So tire pressures are not as straightforward as it seems that they are. I mean, they're kind of straightforward, but I mean, if you really want to get the most performance and comfort out of your bicycle, you should experiment with the tire pressures. So if you imagine that your weight is uh, concentrated over the back tire, you have less weight over the front tire. So that's the reason why the front tire pressure is lower. I can run 22 psi in the front and 28 in the rear. And for a smaller rider like myself, I mean, I typically weigh anywhere in the range of 125 to 135 pounds. So that's why I can run the tire pressures as low as I run them. So heavier riders would typically run their pressures a little higher than I do. And it also depends on the terrain that you're riding on. But basically lowering the tire pressure on the front tire will give you more comfort in the front. You'll get the same effect as you do out of the rear. You can see that the contact patches here are actually the same size, rather than on this illustration where I'm running the same PSI, the front contact patch is actually much smaller. So here you're actually getting more traction. And that's generally what you get with lower tire pressure, is more traction. But you'll actually have less in the front if you run an equal amount of tire pressure, because of the fact that your weight is concentrated over the back tire. So even if you want to run a higher tire pressure, such as 35 or 40 psi or even higher for something like a road bike, you really want to lower the front tire pressure to try to give you an equal amount of contact patch as you have in the rear, and that'll give you the safest the most amount of traction for your bicycle, and it'll actually make you safer, or give you a safer bicycle, because of the fact that you just have more traction. Your brakes will be more effective, and you'll be able to, your steering and your handling will actually be better. The only issue here is if you lower your front tire pressure too low, then what happens is the wheel will actually begin to move with